Would you like to play some football?
Hey, welcome to another edition of Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast. The Final Four of the college football playoff is set, and they earned their way in. I'm George Schroeder.
And I'm Brad Edwards. And look, by seeding, this would not be the four you would expect. It's the 5, 6, 7, and 8 seeds. The top 4 seeds went winless in the first college football playoff of 12 teams. And George, I think that the most surprising part about that is that of those 1 through 4 seeds, the one that came the closest to winning was the 4 seed. And especially with that being Big 12 champion Arizona State. And we'll get into that one in just a little bit. That was an incredible game.
Yeah, it really was. And we'll get to that for sure. But real quick, the Final Four, and if you caught what I was saying, we've had a Final Four, but it's been typically set in a committee room on a Sunday in early December. Now we've got 12, as we all know. And so we played the first round, we played the quarterfinals, and the Final Four is going to be Penn State, Notre Dame, Texas, and Ohio State. And I did not do that in their seeding order. I just did it as I was reading it off the sheet here. But and so congrats to those teams. And it's a pretty cool group, quite frankly. So I'm excited about it. Which game do you want to start with? So we had the Fiesta Bowl on New Year's Eve, Penn State versus Boise State. We're supposed to have 3 games, and we'll get into why we didn't, on New Year's Day. The Peach, Texas and Arizona State. The Rose, Ohio State and Oregon. What looked like a traditional Big 10, Pac-12 matchup was not. It was a rematch of Big 10 foes. And then the Sugar, which was supposed to be played that evening, Notre Dame and Georgia, and it got pushed back a day because of the tragic events on Bourbon Street where there was a terror attack.
Yeah.
And 14 people lost their lives early New Year's morning, about 3 a.m. And so the game was postponed today for security reasons, which, by the way, first of all, prayers for the families of those who were killed and prayers for those who were injured. And I don't have an update on that, but what a terrible thing. And obviously the authorities are still getting to the bottom of it, but what a horrible thing. And it puts into perspective everything that we're about to talk about.
Yeah. And George, while we're on that topic, we might as well mention prayers also for the Smart family.
That's right.
We learned after the game was over that Kirby Smart's father, Sonny, had fallen on New Year's Eve while he was in New Orleans for the game. Complications arose with the surgery, and he ended up passing away after the game had been played. I think it was the next day, the day after the game. But obviously that's something that nobody saw coming, and it just it just kind of speaks to how fragile life is, and we can't ever take tomorrow for granted, and that's one of the reasons why. And so
that's right.
Just one of those things to add to the list of I was gonna say injuries and fatalities. Obviously his was unrelated to you mentioned the terror event in New Orleans, but one more person, one more family that we want to keep in our prayers.
For sure. Sonny Smart was 76 years old, a longtime high school football coach in Alabama and Georgia, well known, not simply because his son, played at Georgia and then is, obviously the coach of the Bulldogs. A terribly tragic event, and obviously just as tragic or multiplied right exponentially because of more people and because of the act of terror. Just, as I said, it puts everything in perspective. So let's pray. Let's be praying for those families. Let's be praying for those families. I know a lot of people are. I just want to encourage you to keep doing it.
Yeah.
What tends to happen is as time goes on, we forget about it. And those families are living with the residue, with the aftermath for a lifetime, frankly. So there's no good segue here. So I will just jump into it.
The rest is just football. Yeah,
that's right. The rest is just football. As much as we love college football, it's just a diversion. But the quarterfinals, Fiesta, Peach, Rose, and then eventually the Sugar were really interesting. They were better. They were not all better games than we like we'd hoped. Some of them were, but they were really. There's tremendous storylines that happened within them. Just to dispense with it, the Fiesta Bowl went about like both you and I both thought it would. That was a New
I think
Year's Eve
so.
game. Penn State, we thought, as if you listened to us last week, was better than Boise State. No offense to the Broncos, and they were. They were just better. They won 31-4. The Broncos never, were never completely out of it, but it never really felt to me like Penn State was in serious jeopardy once they built a lead. They were just bigger and better. And I have to say this, Penn State's a different team than I don't know if they're a different team than we thought they were in the regular season or if they've just developed. And I think that's one of the things about the playoffs is we can see teams grow. The way this expanded playoff is, we can see teams grow in a way we wouldn't have seen that before because just the postseason was different. And frankly, we may not see it happen all the time because the other thing that can happen is people get injured at a key position or whatever, and it changes the complexion of their team. And we can talk about that when we get to the Sugar Bowl. But we can watch teams grow. That's also true, I think, of Ohio State.
Right.
But Penn State has grown into a team. I would not have told you going into the playoff that I really thought Penn State could win it. They'd have been in my group of teams that can win it, but I really wouldn't have thought so. I got to be honest with you. I've got a clear favorite, and I think you do too. But all four of these teams can win the playoff. All four of them can win the playoff.
Yeah, look, I don't have any disagreement with that, just because I think when you get to this level, one game for the national championship, not a series, not a best of 5, best of 7, but just a single game, even the best team out of the 4 could go out there and turn the ball over 3 times, whatever. I mean, the best team is not always going to win when the teams are this close. So yeah, for that reason, I think all 4 teams could win. And I mean, look, just based on talent as far as recruiting rankings and all that stuff, the 2 best are playing each other, Ohio State and Texas, and then you've got Notre Dame and Penn State. But certainly whoever wins that Notre Dame Penn State game in a 1-game scenario, I would give them a pretty good shot against Texas, and I would give them a shot against Ohio State. But we'll talk about how the teams got there first. So yeah, going back to what you said, George, I think it ended up like we thought. That Penn State did a good job of slowing down Ashton Jeanty, I should say. And they slowed him down enough that he was not a real factor in the game. I think Boise really surprised me with their ability to move the ball through the air. But ultimately, I think the difference in the game was that when they got down inside of the Penn State 30-yard line, they weren't able to get into the end zone often enough, and that's why they never really threatened, as you said, in the fourth quarter. But I didn't think, even though the final score might suggest otherwise, I didn't think that Boise State looked like they didn't belong. I thought they moved the ball well enough to maybe not justify their seeding, but certainly to justify them being on the field and competing for the national championship. And a lot of people will always have a question about that group of 5 team and whether they deserve to be there. And they definitely, let's put it this way. If you were to rank the 12 teams based on what we saw, Boise State wasn't close to being the weakest of the 12.
No, they wouldn't have been number 3 and they wouldn't have been number 4. And by the way, they weren't the 4th. They weren't the 3rd best of those conference champs.
Right.
ASU was. Arizona State was. I'm just going to tell you that. But they were good enough to make a run at people, and they did. Listen, this tournament, and that's funny because I start calling it a tournament. That's what it is. Finally,
it is a tournament.
This tournament is built. There's going to be some years are going to be 2 teams that can win it, just like before. Some years are going to be 4 or 5 teams that can win it, like you and I have been saying. And I think all 4 teams that are remaining can win it now. What that means is there aren't ever going to be 12 teams that can win it. And for that reason, there has to be access for the group of 5, and there has to be access that is granted to people based on what they did in a season, not based on what hypothetically we think they could have done or might do. Though that has to happen because when you get to that back half of the actual true seeding, the lower seeds, and by lower, I mean, 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever the whatever the line of demarcation is that year. When you get to that place where you're not really talking about people that can actually win you've got to maintain access. It can't just be, and man, now I'm in an off-season topic here, but it can't just be, let's take 4 from this league and 5 from that league and whatever, or 6 and 6, or however you want it. It can't just be that. There has to be access for people, and there has to be access given based on what you did in the season, not based on what we think you might do, or because you happen to sit in this particular conference. So I'm great with Boise. I'm okay with kind of how it played out this year. You and we both agree that the automatic qualifier for the top 5 ranked conference champions makes sense, but that the buys given to the top 4 doesn't make sense. So go ahead, if you were going to make a change, and I don't think they're going to, as you and I talked about in our extensive pre-show production meeting, but if you're going to make a change, then just do the true seeding. Do automatic qualification for the top 5 conference champions, and then seed them, everybody 1 through 12, and give 1, 2, 3, and 4 the buys, whoever that ends up being. And then, had they done that, we'd had a different setup than we have right now. And we wouldn't have had some of the things we're going to talk about here in a minute, where you just said you think the 2 best teams are going to play in one semifinal. And you're talking about Texas and Ohio State. I would tell you that I think the 2 best teams played in the quarterfinals.
Yeah. I said the 2 most talented teams, and I meant out of the 4 that are remaining.
Well, I wasn't arguing with you, but no, 2 most talented out of remaining. What I'm saying is, you wouldn't have had a setup where Oregon, the number 1 seed, and look, you got to win whenever somebody comes around, or it doesn't matter. You wouldn't have had them playing what is probably the best team in the quarterfinals. It would be a different setup. So anyway, but now I've hopped down a rabbit trail, and you didn't stop me,
so
Brad.
let me reel us back. Okay, so we talked about how because of the seeding format that you mentioned, we had the unexpected result of the top 4 seeds all losing. But as I said earlier, the one that came the closest to winning was actually the 4 seed. And look, before the season began, you probably would have had a number of people who would have predicted that 3 and 4 would lose, right? That they would not win their quarterfinal games, just because they, more likely than not, were not as good as the teams that they were going to play. It would have been a surprise to pretty much everyone if you had told them that 1 and 2 were both going to lose.
The champions that we knew would be from the Big Ten and the SEC in one way or the other. It turned out to be Big Ten champion 1 and SEC 2. We would not have thought they would have lost the first time out.
And by the way, as it turned out, the 5 conference champions that got into the playoff all went 1 and done. But coming back to the one that came the closest to winning was Arizona State. And so that's the game that, I want to focus on next. So Arizona State against Texas.
Peach
I don't
Bowl,
even
New Year's Day.
Yeah, it's good. You clean it up as far as what bowl. I don't even remember what city it was played in. It was just
Texas 39, Arizona State 31. That's the Peach Bowl's played in Atlanta. So, and I know you know that, but
but you know what? Unfortunately, that's what happens when you're not playing this round on campus sites, is that on TV, every dome looks the same. Now, the Rose Bowl obviously stands out, but you get all these games in domes, and it's like, I don't remember what, I think back over the national championship games over the years, and I have a hard time keeping them straight, what city they were played in, because on TV, they kind of all look the same. But
that's right.
So in this case, in Atlanta, Arizona State started very slow, or Texas started fast, however you want to say it. Now, was that a result of Texas having played 11 days earlier and Arizona State having not played for 4 weeks? We'll never know. There's no way to say for sure, but Texas jumped on ASU quickly. I believe it was 17-3 out of the gate, something like that. And it looked like it was going to be a runaway, like the blowout that a lot of people expected. Arizona State had some opportunities in Texas territory that they didn't capitalize on. And about midway through the third quarter, it felt like, they let the game get away from them. Not that most people ever thought they had a great chance, but because they didn't get touchdowns when they had those opportunities, that that their chance had passed them by. And at one point in the fourth quarter, Texas is up by 16. You would think at that point the game was over, but Arizona State, man, what they did after that was amazing. Texas, after being able to contain Cam Scatterbu fairly well for at least the first half, he started to,
He went off.
get some gains on the ground, also catching some passes. He was kind of doing everything. And then the play that really got them back in the game was the pass that he threw on a fourth down that got the touchdown, and then the 2-point conversion that got them within one score. And that was the crazy thing. You would think that the Arizona State up against Texas and that Texas defense, the likelihood of them not only scoring 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter, but also getting the 2-point conversions they needed to overcome that 16-point deficit and tie it up, that was, that was incredibly unlikely. They managed to do that, and then they got a stop, got the ball back. And actually, to say they got a stop, Texas missed a field goal. They get the ball back, and there was a lot of controversy, George. I don't know what your take was on it, over a no call, or actually a reversal, right? On a replay reversal.
They did not call.
Oh, they didn't call it on the field.
And then they didn't assess it on the review.
But it looked like targeting, and it was not called, and it would have put Arizona State, if not in field goal range, certainly on the edge of field goal range for a potential game-winning field goal. Instead, Texas gets the ball back, doinks a game-winning field goal attempt, and we're off to overtime. But just as far as the fourth quarter, like, what were your impressions of that comeback by ASU?
It felt, here's what the first time, and I think we're going to see this more often, maybe not in quarters, but sometimes. It felt for the first time in a college football memory for me, in a postseason situation, like the 12-5 matchup in the NCAA tournament in basketball, where by all rights, maybe the 4-13 or something like that, by all rights, the other team is better, but for some reason they can't put somebody away.
Yeah.
And by the way, when we get to talking a little bit more about Texas, best defense, Quinn Ewers played clutch, was really good, but their offense is inexplicable to me. So we can talk about that in a minute. But it felt like one of those games where, and then in a neutral site game in the NCAA basketball tournament, the crowd gets behind the underdog and all that.
Right.
Now, that was not the case because it was equally split fan bases, or however it was, right? But maybe more Texas than Arizona State, I don't know. But there weren't a bunch of fans of other teams there. And it just had that feel of the underdog is going to come back and win this thing. And I don't know how to account for it. First, Arizona State is not as physically talented as Texas. Let's go with that. But second, Arizona State's a lot better than any of us gave them credit for.
Yeah.
They're a lot better. And I think that as we sit here and think about this, I'm not trying to take a lot from bowl season other than the playoff, but I think BYU was better than people gave them credit for. They didn't even get into that jumbled mess. They didn't even get into the Big 12 championship game. Iowa State was better than people gave them credit for. I think the Big 12 looks pretty good in this postseason, even in a loss from Arizona State. And you wonder, why in the world was the ACC getting a lot of deference? Maybe the Big 12 is the one that should have been ranked higher all year long. But because ASU was ranked so low, I think we see it as a bigger near upset than it even was. That's a pretty darn good team.
Yeah.
We talk about Cam Scatterbu. Sam Leavitt played really well.
Yeah, he did.
He's a pretty darn good quarterback. Anyway, that fourth quarter just unfolded, and you're like, this is amazing. And, no dog in the fight for you or for me on any of these teams. That was just, I'm not rooting for the underdog, but I'm just sitting there going, this is great. This is what you wanted. And they come all the way back, and you're right, Auburn misses not one, but two field goals, a 48 and a 38, and they go to overtime. And not only do they score in the first overtime, then they got Texas in a 4th and 13.
Yeah.
4th and 13. And all Quinn Ewers does is clutch, step up, take one step up in the pocket, and pop the ball for a touchdown. A great play, and as clutch a play as we'll see in a critical moment like that. And then, of course, he throws another touchdown pass on the very next play because they get the ball to start the second overtime, and Texas wins going away 39-31. I came away thinking a lot more of Arizona State than I did before, as I mentioned a second ago. And I came away thinking to myself, Texas is really, really good, but there's something about their offense, I can't wrap my mind around, and I cannot wrap my arms around them as you guys could do this. And that's before we talk about their opponent in the next round, which is a real problem. Texas concerns me. And that's even as I say, Quinn Ewers played really well and was super clutch. Texas's offense is inexplicable to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like you look at, defensively and certainly in the playoff, I think their two opponents have moved the ball a little bit better than I expected them to. So the defense has not been as good as advertised, but the offense has a few times this season has put them in games that end up being closer than they should have been.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's because Ewers has made some mistakes, just, thrown a pick here or there. Occasionally they've been tip balls, not necessarily his fault. He did throw a bad pick in the fourth quarter against Arizona State that gave them a chance to kind of get back into the game. But like you said, when the game was on the line, he delivered. He made several good throws in that game. I'm starting to wonder if it's like something with the offensive line and Ewers where it doesn't seem that they both play well in the same game often enough, right? Like
That's
it's just,
right.
that
when they don't play well in the offensive line, it's not just that they don't protect him. They've got a decent run game that is non-existent some days.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And look, for a lot of that game, they were not able to run the ball on Arizona State. The game before against Georgia, they were not able to run. They ran all over Texas A&M. The game before that. But then I'm thinking there was one other game that maybe it was the Arkansas game late that was fairly late in the regular season where they also had their running game shut down. And so you just kind of look at it and you're like, who are they? Because there's some games that go out there, run for 300 yards. And then there are other games they can't break 50. And like you said, this is more of a concern when you start to look ahead to the next opponent and how good they've been on defense for most of the year. And it really, despite all the playmakers that they have at the skill positions, you actually dare to ask yourself the question, how much can Texas move the ball and score? Because they've certainly had a lot of questions raised about that offensive unit. And, we'll get into that more when we break down that game. But certainly that was an element of this game that Texas, with just a little bit more consistent offense, could have put this game in a position where Arizona State would not have been able to come back. But they just sat there and idle for a couple of quarters and didn't increase that lead. And that ultimately was what allowed the Sun Devils to make it a game.
Well, that's right. But ultimately, Texas won as you would expect them to win. So we got Penn State winning and Texas winning. Penn State advances to the Orange Bowl and Texas advances to the Cotton Bowl. They go from Georgia back to the home state of Texas, where they'll have a virtual home game against Ohio State. Ohio State in the Rose Bowl looked incredible. And so we've now seen Ohio State twice since that Michigan debacle at the end of the regular season. Twice. And they blew the doors off of Tennessee at home, which maybe that's not super surprising. But then, if you recall, their only loss other than Michigan all year long was in Eugene against Oregon. And all Oregon did all year long was win, 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 win. They were unbeaten. They were the undisputed number one seed. And I picked Oregon last week in part because of my son, but also thought to myself, I think the best, most consistent quarterback was Dylan Gabriel. Well, Will Howard looked really good. And it was 34-0 at one point in the first half as Ohio State just blew the doors off of the Ducks. Like the Ducks were not the number one seed. I mean,
they were a mid-tier team in some conference, and
right.
That's what you would expect to see in a early November Big Ten game, right?
And let's just start with this. Oregon's really, really good, really good. I guess they don't have the highest ceiling. We figured that out, but they're really good. They easily could have won the national title. That Ohio State team is a juggernaut.
Yeah.
When they play like that. And maybe if you want to go back one more game, like the first round game against Tennessee, that's a different animal than anything else we've seen from any other team all season long, and certainly in this 12-team playoff. Not saying they can sustain it. I'm saying that's different. That's another level entirely than anybody else.
Yeah. I think that's the question at this point is, can they do that 3 times in a row? Can they do
they
it a
have
4th
to?
time in
But
a row?
Julie, that's their A+.
Do they have to?
game.
That's a good
Do
question.
you have to have the A+ game?
Right. And I
I'm
think
not
we
sure they
saw,
do.
yeah, I think we saw the A+ game each of the last 2. And you know, look, I could make a pretty good argument those are the 2 best games Ohio State played all year. Now
I think there's no question.
you know, they looked really good in dominating Indiana late in the season. They, you know, went into Penn State and won, but I don't think either of those was the type of performance that when it was over, you're like, man, nobody can stay with this team if they play like that. That's the way you felt watching them against Tennessee and then again against Oregon. And so, yeah, I mean, now, did that change my opinion of them? No. I mean, we said last week when we were previewing the game, this is the team with the highest ceiling. If they play their A+ game, nobody can beat them. And I was not expecting to see it 2 weeks in a row, but there it is. And you know, you mentioned Will Howard. I mean, look, they have a top 3 defense. Ohio State does. They obviously have running backs and receivers who are, if they're not clearly the best skill position guys in all the country, they are on the same line as anybody else. But when you put that with a quarterback who's throwing the ball on target the way that Howard is, in the 2 playoff games so far, Howard has attempted 7 passes more than 20 yards down the field. He has completed all 7 of them, 4 of them for touchdowns. And so that's the type of thing you're like, okay, if they're going to hit every one of their downfield shots, you can't defend them. You know, your best case against Ohio State is that they miss some opportunities to hit some big plays, and then, you know, maybe a mental mistake or a fumble or something like that here and there, and they give you some opportunities in other areas. But if they're not helping you, I just don't see how you're going to beat them. And I think that's the big question moving forward. And for Oregon, I mean, I give Dan Lanning a lot of credit. He did not make a single excuse after that game was over. He didn't say, well, if the seeding had not been messed up, then we wouldn't have had to play them in this round. It was like kind of like the attitude that, like you said, hey, if you're going to win the national championship, you're probably going to have to beat that team at some point. And they caught them on the wrong day. They caught them on a day when Ohio State played as well as it could, as well as anybody in the country could on a given day. And nobody was going to beat them on that day. The fact that Oregon didn't play its best at the same time made it just an absolute walkover.
Let me say this. Oregon's offense really struggled to get moving, and they finally got a little bit going in the second half. Final score 41-21. As I said, it was 34-0, and Oregon scored a touchdown and a 2-point conversion on the final play of the first half, 34-8. But Jeremiah Smith, freshman receiver, I think he's a generational guy, but he was untouchable. Had a couple of long touchdown receptions early. Emeka Egbuka, I can't even say his name.
Yeah, Egbuka,
gets lost next to this true freshman. I think he might be the number 2 best receiver in the country.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly one of the best.
They were uncoverable. And it's not like Oregon doesn't have a halfway decent defense. It's pretty darn good. They were really good. And so I'm going to say this. If Oregon's offense had gotten things going, because Ohio State's defense was really good, and that's one of the untold things of this deal is Oregon has a good offensive line. But they got overwhelmed all game long by Ohio State's defensive front. But if Oregon had been able to kind of play back and forth with them, I don't think Ohio State ever stopped scoring. Like I said, they only scored a touchdown the second half because they didn't have to score anymore.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that Ryan Day called off the dogs. That's not even what I'm saying, although at some point, clearly he did. What I'm saying is it was already over. Had it been a back and forth game, like the kinds, I don't know, one of those Oklahoma, Texas Tech type of games from the Lincoln Riley era, or a couple of those that we've seen some in the playoffs when Oklahoma was in the playoff. Ohio State would have just kept scoring.
Yeah, they easily could have scored in the 50s if they had needed to.
Jeremiah Smith would still be running free. I mean, that was a fantastic performance, unless you're my older son George, who is still in mourning over the Ducks' demise. And I've got many friends from Oregon when we used to live there way back in the day who are no doubt feeling the same. So sorry, y'all. What a great year for y'all. But Ohio State if that's the Ohio State team we're talking about, that's the best team.
Yeah.
And I'm not convinced, as you said a minute ago, that they have to have their A-plus game to be the best team. So just an amazing performance in the Rose Bowl, which takes us, I think, unless you got anything else on the Rose Bowl.
I think the last thing I'll say about Ohio State, and I'll say this because the semifinals be played before the next podcast, and I'll go ahead and get this out now, just in case they were to lose and I don't have another opportunity to say it. But as it sets up right now, I don't think there's any question Ohio State is the favorite to win this thing. The way that they've played, given their talent.
Make some picks here in a minute.
Yeah,
but yeah.
And so I just think it's funny. You look back at the first year of the 4-team playoff, 2014. Ohio State got in as the 4 seed. The previous, whatever it was, 16 seasons, it had been
around
2
here
teams.
In Texas, they remember that.
Yeah, it had been 2 teams that got a chance to play for the national title.
Mm-hmm.
In the previous format, Ohio State would not have gotten the opportunity to be in that game. But 2014, the first year it expanded to 4, they got the opportunity on the field, and then they won the thing. Now we have the 12-team playoff. If it had been like it was for the previous 10 years, 4 teams, Ohio State would not have gotten into a 4-team playoff this season. But because there were more than 4, they got in, and it looks like they're going to win it. It's not a given, but I think it's interesting just to look at the way that that's played out for them. The timing has worked perfectly in that they could potentially end up having, 2 national championships. Where if they had the same season a year earlier, they would not have had a chance to play for the title. But they did it at the right time. So
no, they absolutely did. I'm glad you mentioned that, because Ryan Day made a similar point. I mean, he didn't go back to 2014, but he did make the point that this team has grown has really grown and been able to show its development because of its opportunity, which it wouldn't have had. Think about that.
Yeah,
you're exactly right. 4-team playoff. They're not getting in because of the loss to Michigan.
And by the way, how many opt-outs would they have had for the bowl game?
Right.
Yeah.
It would have been maybe like last year when they played the Cotton Bowl against Missouri. And, hey, love you, Eli Drinkwitz, but you didn't beat an Ohio State team. They were playing their 3rd-team quarterback, and everybody was opted out. So congrats. But because of this, because they have the opportunity, they've been able to grow into something, and we've been able to watch it happen. I kind of mentioned something about that earlier, and so I'm glad you made that point. It is interesting that they have benefited from a change of format twice now. We'll see if they can continue to make it. And there's a pin. I'm going to put a pin in this one, but given the whole atmosphere around Ohio State after they lost to Michigan, right? Will Ryan Day return one way or the other?
Yeah.
However that would work. Just what a debacle everything is. Is that all gone now? And here's what I mean. What if they lose to Texas?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Something to think of, just something to think about. I don't know that we can answer it. Just something to think about.
Oh, and look, and I think some people would say, hey, well, the Michigan loss was the fire that lit the fire under them for the Tennessee performance.
But it lit a fire in the fan base too. They've lost 4 in a row to Michigan.
True.
You can't lose to Michigan.
But then the fact that they had lost to Oregon already in the season was motivation for getting up for the second game.
Yeah.
Now
it's all about winning the national title. That's what they're trying to do.
That's true.
But
at this point,
for each game.
But that's the thing, is that at this level, that should be enough motivation. The fact that you're playing to win the national championship. And I'm not saying that wasn't enough motivation for them in the previous 2 rounds, but if you wanted to point to something else to explain them playing their best game all year and then doing it 2 weeks in a row, you could find something other than the national championship race to point to. This time, this is what it's all about. And I'll tell you this, if they come out and play another A+ game, I'm going to be blown away, because with guys this age, I'm not even getting into all the NIL and all the distractions around that. Just simply 18, 22, 23-year-olds, getting them to focus at that level to play up their potential 3 games in a row. You don't see that very often in a college football season.
Typically with escalating level of
stakes.
opposition. I'm not
Oh yeah, right,
but
yeah.
level of
The
opposition.
competition,
Now, I
yeah.
don't know that I'm going to say Texas is better than Oregon or whatever, but very similar, right? So they clearly Oregon's better than Tennessee. Texas is at least Oregon type level ish, and so maybe better. But so it's what you're saying is with higher stakes, 3 games in a row at that level, and then in a fourth game potentially, right, against the best opponents you play all year, basically.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the level is. So it's going to be interesting to see for sure. Let's go to the sugar though, okay?
Yep.
Let's go to the sugar. Notre Dame 23, Georgia 10. Marcus Freeman just delivered for Notre Dame their biggest win in an era. And it's interesting because you and I both covered when I was at USA Today, you were at ESPN. We covered just in the last dozen years some of these Notre Dame teams that would find their way into a BCS title game or a 4-team playoff and wouldn't be able to play physically, match up with the opponents. This one can, and they did. Now we can talk about Georgia here in a minute. They were wounded, and frankly were weird all year. They weren't the Georgia a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But Notre Dame is really, 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 really good, and they're built like any of these other teams at this moment. Agree? Disagree?
Yeah, I think if the one of the biggest surprises of the season, like you look back on it, is like how did they lose to Northern Illinois? Because
That's
it
the
wasn't
surprise of the season.
Yeah,
isn't
I
it?
mean, you look back after the games that they played. I mean, not only the win at Texas A&M before that, but all of the other results throughout the season, and there's nothing else they did that would indicate that they would even be capable of playing a close game against Northern Illinois. And so that was just that aberration. And the rest of the year, we've pretty much seen the type of team that a lot of people expected them to be going into the season. And this is kind of a continuation of that. Now, is it essential that they win this game? Like you said, they have been in the last 4 teams standing a few times. Like, they made the one BCS championship game in 2012. They made a couple of the 4-team playoffs and were not competitive in any of those games. But even though, yeah, technically if they lose to Penn State, it would be the same level of advancement. I think the fact that they beat Georgia makes this a clear step forward no matter what happens in this next round. And so, the thing to me, George, like you said, they matched up with Georgia. Now, this was a Georgia team that
size, speed, all those things.
They didn't look like they were going to need some luck, right, to come away with a win, and they didn't really get any. Now they were fortunate, maybe to get a special teams touchdown early in the second half that put Georgia in a position with a backup quarterback where they were unlikely to be able to, to make up that gap. But they made plays when they had to on offense to move the chains, milk the clock to protect that lead, keep Georgia from really getting close enough to get hope. They, defensively, they did what they've done for most of the season, which is they've been, really solid and really at every level defensively. And so, there wasn't anything about it that was surprising on Notre Dame's end. And to me, really, this game came down to, with the Georgia quarterback situation, was there going to be something there that caught us by surprise, right? Were you going to have a performance that was like at a level that you would not have expected from a backup quarterback, and where Notre Dame didn't really know what to expect? And we didn't see that. Gunnar Stockton was good. I mean, I think he was good enough. He wasn't a liability out there. But at the same time, I didn't see a guy. I mean, look, granted, he didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare, but I didn't see a guy who I felt like was on the same level as Carson Beck as far as if he played his best game. Like when Carson Beck is on, like I think Georgia is more capable than what they would have been if Gunnar Stockton plays his best game. So it was a step back at quarterback. And I think Georgia was, strange this seems to say, Georgia was going to need some things to go its way to have a chance to win this game. And they fell behind early, and then they weren't able to really, make any big plays. And Notre Dame just did a good job of getting in front and not making any mistakes, and kind of cruised to victory.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was 6-3 It was what? It was 3-all.
It was 3-3 late in the first half.
3-3 late in the first half. And then
a minute to go, right? Like a minute to go in the first half. It's 3-3.
48-yard. Yeah, Notre Dame kicks a field goal with 39 seconds left in the first half.
Yeah,
and then scores 2 touchdowns within the next minute.
Right. Yeah.
Of gameplay, meaning first half, second half.
They had the sack fumble, and then that kickoff return after the end of the first half touchdown.
Yeah, was it? I don't know. Wasn't an interception? I think it was.
No. It was a sack and a fumble.
It was a
short field that they turned into a touchdown.
Right. And I knew it was a short field. I couldn't remember if it was an interception, but basically, and afterward at the end of the first half, and this is before the kick return to start the third quarter, Kirby Smart made the point. He had some regrets about maybe you should just 6-3. This game is about what you need it to be. Now, I think that Notre Dame was going to grind their way to victory because, as you said, Georgia was the one that needed good things to happen. I think Notre Dame was the better team against a Georgia team with the backup quarterback, Gunnar Stockton. But when Stockton got sacked and they hit, and real quickly, Riley Leonard threw the 13-yard pass to Bo Collins for the touchdown, the very next play, that game turned in a hurry and it was over. Mm-hmm. And Kirby Smart probably should have been thinking about the fact that this freshman quarterback has not demonstrated a whole lot of pocket awareness. He's struggling. Maybe we just need to eat this thing, go into halftime down 6-3, regroup. Instead, the whole thing, I'm just telling you, the thing turned then at 13-3 at halftime, before the 95-yard kick return, because Notre Dame was going to got the ball to start the third quarter. If he ends up at the 25 or the 28, they may grind their way down for another field goal or a touchdown anyway. Notre Dame was just better than this version of Georgia with a backup quarterback. Now, would they have been better with Carson Beck? That's the easy thing to say. But that takes us back to, we've talked a little bit about Notre Dame. What Georgia was this year was they played pretty well for like 4, 6, 7 quarters. And I mean that all year long.
Yeah.
And they needed 8 overtimes to find their way past a mediocre ACC team in Georgia Tech. 8 overtimes. They lost to, help me out here. They lost to Ole Miss. They got blown out, right?
To Alabama.
They lost to Alabama. And now they had 2 really nice wins over Texas. The inexplicable part of Texas came out, and Georgia's defense was pretty darn good. But they're lacking playmakers on the offensive side. Carson Beck, even when he was healthy, I don't know if it's because they lack playmakers or if he just hadn't had a great year, was hit and miss.
Yeah. I mean, part of that is his receivers were hit and miss. They dropped a lot of passes all year.
This is sacrilege.
Yeah.
I think Notre Dame wins with Carson Beck playing for Georgia.
Oh, it's very possible. If Carson Beck played the way that he played in 75% of their games this year, they don't beat Notre Dame with him.
Because Notre Dame's defense is good.
Yeah.
It's good. So regardless, they had very little chance with the backup, even though they did what they could, and that's no slight to him. He was put in a tough situation, but just all year long, this was not the Georgia we've come to know.
Yeah,
it was a different Georgia. That's all I'm saying.
So there are 2 topics that I really would like to discuss off of this. One of them I think we'll save for next week, because even though we'll be down to 2 teams at that point, I think just looking at the 4 coaches in the semifinals, we can still have that discussion. But what I want to talk about, I think it needs to be talked about, is the SEC. That this, and you were on this midway through the season, which is that the SEC had more parity this year.
It flattened.
But that it seemed to be because the best teams were not as good as they normally were.
Well, I do think some of the other teams were better than they had been.
No, I think they're both true. Yeah.
But what that means is, it doesn't mean that, but correspondingly what you're saying is the teams that have been elite, frankly, weren't elite. They moved downward. Doesn't mean that they couldn't still have done a lot of great things.
And now having one more game in that sample for Georgia and Alabama, even though I realize it's a non-playoff bowl game and we're not going to read too much into it.
Okay, but if we're going to do that, we're talking about the ReliaQuest Bowl in Tampa against Michigan. Michigan had their top 2 running backs and a bunch of other guys opt out.
Oh, yeah.
Alabama had most of their basically every key contributor stayed and played. And
Well,
they
not all,
got
but
beaten.
I'll say this. Alabama was missing a few guys, but Michigan was missing way more on their two deep than Alabama was. And Alabama's quarterback was clearly
playing
better than Michigan's quarterback, right? But
they lost to a 7-5 Michigan team. Now, I guess 8-5, right? But
so I just think that we got further confirmation in the bowl season that Georgia and Alabama were not nearly what they had been and have been in recent years. And nobody else stepped up. Like there wasn't an LSU or someone that ended up like filling that void and being the elite team. Ole Miss was good, but they weren't at that great level. And I think that's what the SEC was. Now the question is, and we can't answer this, is this a one-year deal or has something changed in college football? Like a lot of people want to make this jump and say, okay, because of NIL and the transfer without sitting out and all this, is that now the SEC won't be able to stockpile talent the way that they have. That may be true, right. But I think it's too soon.
It's not true. The SEC will still stockpile talent. The Big Ten, to a slightly lesser degree, will still stockpile talent. What has changed and what I think will continue to change is Georgia and Alabama and whoever else you want to put in there this year, LSU, they're not, whoever it is, they're not going to stockpile all the talent. It's going to be spread out across the SEC and some other leagues too.
Yeah.
Because you're not just going to have these backups who could be stars somewhere else.
Right.
You're going to have guys going other places. So their depth isn't as good. And they're also not as good I think we came to find out they're not as good all the way across their top 22.
Right. Yeah.
So that's good. But the SEC itself may have essentially the same number of those kind of players. They're just spread further across the league.
And I think the question kind of related to this is this Ohio State team, might they be the last super team that we see? Because they had a bunch of guys who could have gone to the NFL after last season. Not only did they pony up to keep those guys, convince them to stay for another year, but they were able to go into the portal, get some key pieces to fill a few holes that they had, a few areas where they could get better. They did that, and I just wonder how rare will and I would say that this year's Ohio State team, as far as their overall talent, position by position, is on par with what Georgia and Alabama have been. And quite honestly, Ohio State has had some of those teams itself in recent years. That's the type of team, that's the amount of talent that seems impossible to keep on a roster moving forward. Will the Buckeyes, we know they got a lot of money. Will someone like them or Texas be able to continue to have teams like that? I don't know, but I think that's really where all this comes down to is, can you keep a roster that talented, that many players willing to stay, even for the goal of winning a national championship?
Right. Well, that's the question, right? And I do think we're going to see this. We may see more super teams, but we're going to see them pop up in different places probably. Maybe it won't be the same teams. Maybe I'm wrong. And that's something that we'll just have to wait and see. Maybe the same old teams are going to be the same old teams because, among other things, they've got the most resources. But I do think that college football has clearly flattened with the era of NIL and transfer portal, free transfers, the combination of that. And you saw that this year all over college football, but within the SEC. So going to be real interesting to see what happens. So I think I know we could keep going here. We probably need to do the picks.
Absolutely. Let's go.
So let's go ahead. So the picks are sponsored by the Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor's Truett Seminary. We really appreciate those guys. Think deep, lead strong, run the race well. The Faith and Sports Institute is a team of athletes, coaches, chaplains, and scholars who provide theological education, compelling research, and formative practices for Christian leaders in sports. They've got graduate degree programs and online certificate programs. And they even have a graduate degree, the Master of Arts in Theology and Sports Studies, that is fully online. And I've just got to tell you, Dr. Paul Putz, who is the director of the Faith and Sports Institute, friend of the pod, was on with us a couple episodes ago. Check that out if you haven't. Overlook the part where he's a Nebraska fan. It's all good. You can't help that. He is doing a tremendous job. I love what they're doing in that space where Christianity and sports come together. You and I, that's why we do this podcast.
Yep.
the intersection of faith and sports, our love for college football, our love for Jesus Christ. I just had, as we're recording this podcast, which is on a Sunday night as we usually do, one of my church members texted me a video I'll have to look out later of a news report about revival within college football, right? Now, I look forward to seeing that. We've all seen sort of reports about those kinds of things on social media. Regardless of what anybody thinks about that, that's what the Faith in Sports Institute is about. And so I appreciate those guys. So thank you, the Faith in Sports Institute at Baylor Stewart Seminary, for sponsoring the picks. And our picks are pretty easy here. We're going to pick the two semifinal games. I mean, I don't know that the picks are easy, but it's easy enough to figure out what we're going to pick. We're going to pick the Orange Bowl semifinal, Penn State versus Notre Dame, and the Cotton Bowl semifinal, Texas, Ohio State. So we'll start with the Orange Bowl, Penn State and Notre Dame on Thursday of this week.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it needs to be pointed out that because of what happened with the Sugar Bowl, Penn State actually has 2 more days of rest
and preparation.
Preparation, if you want to. I mean, they didn't know who their opponent was until the Notre Dame game was over, but definitely 2 more days of rest. Now, I don't think that's a significant thing. There might be coaches who would disagree. I look at it and I say, hey, you know what? Notre Dame played on a Thursday. They're going to come back and play on a Thursday. It's the same rest as they normally. It's kind of like if one team had played on a Thursday and the other one played on a Saturday, and then the next week they played each other on a Saturday. It happens all the time during the regular season. So I don't think that's a factor here. I look at this, and for me, first of all, it's not an easy game to pick, but my pick is going to be based on the fact that I think, well, I say fact, it's an opinion. Based on my opinion that Penn State is a little bit more potent on offense. And I say that because I think they're more dangerous in the passing game. I think Penn State is capable of moving the ball through the air if they need to. If they fall behind and they need to throw, they can do it. I'm not sure I have the same confidence in Notre Dame if they get down 2 scores, midway through the fourth quarter and need to kind of hurry up, go into the quick score mode, maybe even 10 minutes left in the fourth quarter. So that to me is about the only difference between these teams. They both run the ball well. It's not like Penn State throws for a ton of yards. I just think they're better equipped to do it. Obviously, both teams are very solid defensively. And I think that one little edge in the passing game is what makes me lean to Penn State. But I don't love them in this game. That's where I'm going because I have to make a pick.
Yeah, listen, I understand that. Listen, I like Riley Leonard, and his legs are a big part of Notre Dame's offense, and that is not to be dismissed. He's a credible passer, but not an incredible passer. So I think that makes sense. I also think I think Penn State's defense is a monster. I don't think we understood that. And the other thing I would say is, look, Drew Aller has been really good and kind of a revelation. He's been better in these big games, even in the loss to Oregon in the Big Ten championship game. He played well. But the thing I think, and so you were talking about the pass game, and that's really important. The thing I think that gets overlooked when it comes to Penn State is they've got a running back tandem that is really good. Yep. Really, really good in Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton. Those guys are good, and they complement each other well. Both of them run for 1,000 yards. I mean, that doesn't happen that often.
Right.
And so, but just listen, I'm going to go with the luck of the Irish here.
Okay.
I'm going with Notre Dame. I think Marcus Freeman, by the way, one of the things we didn't talk about was, man, he had a couple of coaching moments where he outfoxed Kirby Smart the other night.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think this is a guy who's learning on the job, quite frankly.
Yeah.
And he's a presence in the room. I get that. It made sense for him to be elevated when Brian Kelly left for LSU so that he could go win national titles. And now Marcus Freeman's got Notre Dame playing at a higher level than Brian did. And I think Brian Kelly's a tremendous coach. But I think Marcus Freeman is a really good coach. One other thing we should note. Either Marcus Freeman or James Franklin is going to win this. Their team's going to win this game, which means we're going to have an African-American head coach in the national title game for the first time. That's pretty cool. too, by the way.
You know,
So,
George, I mean, I got to be honest with you. I was not even aware that it had not happened before. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing for the sport, that there have been enough African-American head coaches at prominent programs. I remember, you remember, 20 plus years ago when it seemed like it was either the group of five conferences or the lower tier teams in the power conferences were where they were getting those opportunities. That's no longer the case. And so, I'm glad that this milestone will be reached, but I'm also glad that it's not something that is really much of a conversation anymore. At least it's not in any circles that I'm in, and I think that the coaches out there who have had opportunities have done enough with those opportunities that people aren't asking those questions anymore, as to whether they should continue to get them. They've taken advantage of them, and I think that's great. So,
cool.
yeah, and the other thing, I was just going to say, the other thing about the coaches in the semifinals is that none of them has a national championship. There will be a first-time national champion. Kirby Smart was the only one of the quarterfinal head coaches who had a national championship under his belt. So there will be, like there was last year, was a first-time champion with Jim Harbaugh. There will be a first-time champion this year with one of these four. And one of the things that I want to get into next week, I'm not going to say why, is that it's going to be a fairly young head coach winning a national championship, because these coaches have, I want to say James Franklin is the oldest of the group at 52 years old, which I'm 53, so I don't think that's old.
Yep. Yep. Well, that's a next week topic for sure. So you've got Penn State, I've got Notre Dame in the Orange Bowl, one semifinal, and then the one that's the marquee game probably out of that group, which is funny because this is 4 blue bloods, is the Cotton. That's on Friday. Texas versus Ohio State in Jerry World, Arlington, Texas. Texas, Ohio State. I'll just tell you, I'll just go right here. I'm picking Ohio State.
Yeah.
I'm picking Ohio State. I mean,
no
I could go with a lot of
needed.
analysis.
Yeah,
but I think Ohio State is the best team. They're the most talented team. They've got the highest ceiling. We've said all those things.
Yeah.
I'm picking Ohio State.
Yeah, and look, for whatever it's worth, I don't think the crowd is going to be a big advantage. I know Texas is playing in Dallas, but I would be shocked if Ohio State doesn't have at least a third of the crowd. I don't think it's going to be like playing a road game. So, and even if it is, I think this team is veteran enough that they would handle the situation anyway. The chance I'm with you. I'm picking Ohio State. The chance I would give Texas is that I think they're good enough up front defensively that they could pose some problems for Ohio State. We saw Ohio State's offensive line struggle against Michigan. We saw them struggle against Nebraska in the regular season. They didn't exactly dominate Indiana, even though the game, the final score was lopsided. There were some special teams plays that contributed to that. So I think there still could be some questions there with that, even though they could not have played any better the last 2 weeks, as we've discussed, against teams that are pretty good up front defensively. But I think Texas has the guys in the trenches that if it's possible for someone to disrupt them up front, put pressure on Will Howard, maybe not allow him to be as comfortable as he's been the last 2 games, Texas is that team. My question is, even if they hold Ohio State to say 24 points, can Texas score 24 on them? Right. We talked earlier about that offense and what an enigma it is. Yeah, I don't know that I've got a lot of confidence that Texas can score in the 20s. And so to me, Ohio State, just based on what we've seen these last 2 games, is a pretty easy pick.
I think so too. And, which probably means we're going to be wrong, but you've got Ohio State. I've got Ohio State. You've got Penn State. I've got Notre Dame. So we at least opposite each other. And that's it for the first half.
Yeah.
We need to go ahead and take a quick break and come back. And we're going to talk about our shared faith in Jesus Christ, the thing that's what we love to talk about the most. So we'll be right back to talk about that.
Let's do it.
Right after this. All right. 63 minutes, man.
Woo.
Wow.
Okay.
Is what it is.
Yep.
All right.
The Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor's Truett Seminary is a place where Christian leaders in sports are formed and equipped through theological education, practical training, and useful resources. As a sports ministry leader, coach, athlete, pastor, or student who wants to learn more, you can apply for admission in an online or residential graduate degree program, take continuing education certificate classes, and participate in character and leadership practicums. Start your journey at baylor.edu/truett/FSI. Think deep, lead strong, and run the race well with the Faith and Sports Institute today.
And welcome back to the second half, Gridiron of the Gospel. And this is where we dig into our faith in Jesus. And George, we're going to start off the way that we always do.
Yeah, the segment is called On My Heart, and it's where you and I, we basically alternate, not exactly a back and forth all the time, with kind of sharing what we believe God has put on our heart in recent days. And so it's my favorite segment by far of this entire show, this entire podcast, not a show. And this week, Brad, you're up to tell us what's on your heart.
Yeah, so this morning in our high school class, we were having a discussion about faith and just kind of trying to get in to what faith is. What does it really mean? And how do we kind of define that as far as how it applies to our lives? And so we first looked at just the idea that even though people have a tendency to look at the Bible and God is different in the Old Testament than in the New Testament. And people like look at the Old Testament and they see, okay, it's about following rules and laws, commandments in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, it's about faith. And that's not really true if you pay close attention to exactly what God is asking of the people. And yes, he does ask them to follow commandments. There's no question about that. All right. I should say he doesn't ask them. They're commandments. They're expected to follow them. But if you read carefully, they're supposed to do it out of love. And it is a desire to follow God is what that's based on, not just a desire to follow rules. And one of my professors used to describe this in this way. I think it's a very good term, is believing loyalty. That's what God wants out of us, is believing loyalty. And it doesn't matter whether you look at it in the Old Testament or the New Testament or how, we approach it today. It's the same thing, is that what God wants is for us to trust in him and in him alone. And one of the early examples of this, as we're looking at the Old Testament, we talked about Abraham. And this is something that Paul, touches on in Romans 4, is that it's mentioned that when God told Abraham about what he was going to do as far as blessing him, not only with a son, but with descendants from that son, and that son was going to come from Sarah, who was, about 90 years old at the time, at least at the time of the birth of Isaac. It said that Abraham believed and it was counted to him as righteousness, right? And so that's kind of the jumping off point that Paul makes, which is that it was not when he followed the commandment of circumcision that God approved of Abraham. It was before that. It was based on his faith. It was based on his trust in God. And so we use this to kind of get into what the difference is between belief that, and this is something I learned from J. Warner Wallace. I think I've brought his name up before, but he's a pretty well-known apologist and is a guy who used to be in the police force. He was a police detective. And so this was kind of a personal example that he used that I think is very helpful. And I shared this with the high schoolers. He described it this way, which is that when he was on the police force, that the guys were out in the field, they would be given a bulletproof vest to wear underneath their uniform. And they would be shown, given certain data about the vest, and it's going to do this, and that if you're shot by this type of weapon from this type of distance, it's going to protect you against that. And he said that when you have that information, and you have this vest, you have this belief that it can protect you, it can save your life. He said it's a very different story if someone puts that vest on you and then they take about 10 paces away, pull a pistol, and say, all right, are you ready for me to fire? We're going to test this vest to see how it works. He said at that point, that's when you have to put your belief in the vest, right? Is it going to do what it says it's going to do, or what you've been told? Is it going to deliver? And that's what our belief in God is all about. It's not belief that God exists, that he's real. And it's not even belief that God can do the things that he says he's going to do for us. It's belief in him that he will deliver, that he will keep his promises. And when you start to look at it from that way, there are a couple of verses that jump out. And I don't want to make it seem like, okay, that in the English translation, it's going to come out perfectly every time. But there are a couple of places that are evident where you look at this and you see this belief in. And one of them is John 3:16. So for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should have everlasting life. And so belief in, like, it's a very different thing than just believing that God is there or that he can do this. And then it also, in the the first chapter of John, in verse 12, he says, "But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." And so this is what our faith is based on, is that belief in God and that he will deliver. And then we kind of closed it up by talking about in James, when James talks about faith without works. And if we have faith without works, there's a problem there. And I mentioned to the students that, like, this is one of those things where if you have faith and there are no works as a result of it, it's possible, if not probable, that what you actually have is faith that, not faith in. Because if you have faith in God, that it's going to result in, or it should result in, the understanding of what he has done for you, what he's done for all of us, that should translate into us wanting to do things for others, to us wanting to serve others because of what God has done for us. And so, I don't know if that's helpful for a lot of people in our audience. I don't know if it's helpful for a lot of kids who are college age, but I think it's one kind of simple way to look at faith and to look at different ways that it can manifest, and really to kind of ask ourselves the question, what type of faith do I have? Do I have a belief that God is out there and that he can do certain things, is capable of doing certain things, or do I have a belief in him that he will do what he says that he's going to do, and that I can put my trust, my life, and my eternal existence in that, and that I can live accordingly. And that's really what it comes down to. That's what's on my heart right now.
It's trusting him with your life. That's exactly right. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And one thing I would say too is God is the same God, Old Testament, New Testament.
Right.
That is a common sort of thought, that for whatever the topic is, he's an angry God in the Old Testament and a loving God in the New Testament. No, he's the same God. And also he had this different system. It was all about work, follow these rules in the Old Testament versus New Testament. You handled that really well. I appreciate that. I would just want to point out a couple of places in the Old Testament, because you're right. Paul said Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. You're exactly right. The Old Testament, in Hosea, God says, "For I desire faithful love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." In other words, he wants faith. He wants your heart. And then you offer the burnt offerings, the good works, to him as evidence of your changed heart. David, the psalmist, wrote in Psalm 51, which is a very famous psalm because he's confessing his sin. He says, "The sacrifice pleasing to God is a broken spirit. You will not despise a broken and humbled heart, God." And there's other places I could have gone. Those are just a couple that I thought of. But same God, same way to get to him. Just we now have to place our faith and trust in Christ. And but he desires our heart. And then the works, the good works, they follow because we love him. But you're right, we have to believe in him. It's easy to believe the concept of a God. It's probably not that hard to believe the concept of the Christian God, the true God. It's probably not that hard to believe the concept, in some ways, that Jesus came to earth and died to pay the penalty for sin, rose again, conquering death. But believing that's one thing. You're right. Believing in him, trusting in him, is a whole nother thing. Do I trust him with my life? Do I trust him for salvation? So I'm so glad that you had that conversation. And I've said this dozens of times on this podcast. I'm so glad that you are teaching the high schoolers in your church about Jesus, and you're sharing some of that with us on a regular basis. So thanks for doing that, Brad.
It's
I
a
appreciate
privilege
it.
to be able to do that. I think anybody who works with, I would say anybody who works with any group in the church would say that, but certainly with kids, and especially at that age where they're so impressionable and they're starting to make these decisions about, do I really believe this stuff? Because many of them at that point, it's their parents' faith is what has them sitting in church, right? That's why they're in that room, is because the whole family goes every Sunday. And at some point, we all have to make that decision if we're part of a church going family. Do I really believe this? Is this what I want to commit the rest of my life to? Obviously, we hope that they all want to continue that. But in order for that to take place, they have to make that faith their own. And part of that is understanding the Bible in a way that they can, that it makes sense to them, right? Because who's going to believe in something that doesn't make sense?
That's right. Hey, let me just encourage you guys. If you have never trusted in Christ, if you're not following him, and you're for some reason still listening to this podcast, even though we finished talking about football, we want to talk with you about that. We want to pray with you about that. We want to share the reasons that we believe in Jesus. We don't just believe that there is a Jesus. We believe he's the Son of God. We believe he died to pay the penalty for sin. We know that he came to earth and then rose again, and he saved us. He saved us. He's trustworthy. You can entrust your soul to him. He's faithful. And my prayer is that you would do that. We would love to talk with you about that. Email us at gridirongospelpod@gmail.com, or reach out on Twitter, or as Brad likes to say, X, at George Schroeder and at JBrad Edwards. And we will love to, we'll end up getting offline. We'll get on the phone, we'll Zoom, whatever. But we'd love to talk with you about that, to share our faith in Christ with you. That's the purpose of this podcast, but we'd love to do it on a one-on-one basis if we can. So, man, thank you again for sharing what's on your heart. I appreciate that, Brad.
Yeah, absolutely. And, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app. We're on all the major podcasting platforms. Just search for Gridiron and the Gospel, or you can follow the links on our show website. And tune in next week. We're going to be cutting the field in half. We'll be down to a championship game when you next hear from us. So listen to us on Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast.